Now, when I asked him how he would like to be introduced this afternoon, he also told me that he is one of the world's top boomerang specialists. Now, what that has to do with his predicting the future, at least he is good at predicting what comes back at you if you throw it. We'll see how that is useful during his speech. He's a great individual. He started out as a Peace Corps volunteer and has that kind of dedication that we know from a lot of colleagues who have done that as well. So with that, can I just introduce Jerry? We'll have a talk, and at the end, I hope you'll leave enough time for some questions as well. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Frank. It's a great pleasure to be here, as it is for anybody on the planet to be at Google. It's one of the greatest enterprises in history. Pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do is, if anybody has a question, ask it at the time that you want to. You don't have to wait to the very end. The Millennium Project was a very far out idea in the late or mid 1980s. The thought was that the year 2000 would occur and journalists would stick microphones down the throats of various futurists around the world and say, okay, tell me everything about the next 1,000 years, or something silly like that. And we were worried that if we had too much to drink the night before, we might not say anything useful and we may waste an opportunity in the year 2000. So the thought was we should create some system, some idea that was important for one generation or one millennium gift to the next. And the thought was to create a global participatory think tank for humanity. There are tons of think tanks for countries, there's think tanks for ideologies, there's think tanks for water, there's think tanks for all kinds of stuff, but there was no think tank for we human beings as a whole. Now, you could say, well, doesn't the World Bank do that? Yes, but they do it for economics. Well, then say, well, what about the CIA? Well, the CIA does it for the United States. But where do you go to get a picture of the whole game? This was during the Cold War, so it was not exactly an easy task. Fortunately, the Cold War ended when we started. We started officially in 1996 after a 3-year feasibility study. I don't know if there's ever been a 3-year feasibility study for anything other than the Millennium Project. And then that before that was a 1-year feasibility study to answer the question that the United Nations University asked us to answer, which was, somebody must be trying to do this already. I mean, it's an obvious idea to have a bunch of futurists around the world collaborating to figure out the whole game. That's an obvious idea. It must be done by somebody. And so far, we couldn't find anybody, so we started. So how do you create a think tank on behalf of humanity? We decided that it had to be pulled together by UN systems, UN University, UNESCO, UNDP, but also involved were governments. The first funding actually came from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for the pre-feasibility study, or the feasibility study, sorry. NGOs, government, corporations, and whoa, how did we do that? We jumped too quickly. We'll be right back here. Okay. Where's my little thing? There we go. All right. So the Millennium Project was put together by UN organizations, governments, NGOs, corporations, and universities. The idea was that if we're going to do this on behalf of humanity, it ought to cut across all these institutional categories. It can't be just an academic exercise. It can't be just a political thing. It can't be just an NGO thing. It had to be cutting across the systems. So we operate as what we call a trans institution. Now, there's no such thing legally as a trans institution. We hope that we will get some country to amend their corporate law. You got non-profit law, profit law, and we want to have trans-institutional law. By a trans-institutional law and registered as a trans-institution, what we mean is that all the people doing the work of whatever it is, whether it's for AIDS or ours happens to be for the future, but for improving education, whatever it happens to be, the people doing the work ought to come from each of these institutional categories, but not a majority of any one. The money should come from all these institutional categories, but not a majority of any one. The governing body of the organization should come from all these categories, but not a majority of any one. And you should prove value at the end of the year, an annual report or some activity, to show that you've produced value for all these institutional categories. Now, the trans institution is an extremely efficient entity. I think it'll be a new kind of institution in the future. We've got all kinds of innovations in software, in medicine, aerodynamics, but we don't have much innovation in institutional design. And I think this is one of them. Because when you want to act, you can act through any of these categories. When you want to do some of your water work, you can act through UNESCO or the UN system, for example. If you want to do some collective intelligence work, which we'll talk about, maybe you can act through Google. But then you're also acted on by all these categories. So when the Millennium Project does work, it wants to be influenced by all these institutional categories, and it wants to act through all those institutional categories. Key element here is they should be self-organizing. If I assign somebody to do it, then I got to manage them. But these should be people who they should be attracted to the activity. So you can't have every corporation involved. You can't have every government involved. It's too complex. But those that want to play, let them self-select so that you have enthusiasm and you get better synergies this way. Now, we have many trans institutions, not perfect, but many ones, around the world we call nodes. And when I use the word node, I mean an intersection of two or more networks. So there's networks of government players, there's networks of corporate players, there's networks of university players. Where they intersect, we call a node. And we have a node here in Silicon Valley. Jack Park is a member here in the audience, and some others in the area are working in venture capital, software, and the things of Silicon Valley. So the idea is that this becomes a brain-picking system for the Millennium Project. How do you pick the brains of the world? Well, this is our answer to that. It's also our answer to, you hear people talk about global, local all the time. This is our management answer to how you do global, local. So that we can send a question out to these nodes, or these 33 nodes around the world, and say, who knows the most about water, for example. Each of these nodes, the node is composed of these different categories, so they can say, okay, who knows the most in universities? Who knows the most in corporations? Who knows the most in NGOs? Who knows the most in the UN representatives here? Who knows the most? And then since they're doing it in their own cultures, they're talking to them in Farsi or Hebrew or whatever language it happens to be, and they're doing the recruitment. So I'm not telling who should be in, they're telling us who should be in. All right, so these nodes then is the factor for a participatory process. They also can be headquarters for something. For example, the Tech Awards here in Silicon Valley was a spin-off of the Millennium Project. And when the Tech Awards got going for innovations in the 5 categories, we said, some of our players in the node here in Silicon Valley said, well, we ought to do something with all these finalists in these Tech Awards. So then they helped get business planning. So it wasn't just to get an award and some publicity and applause. They now get venture capital, business management training, innovations from a lot of shots here in Silicon Valley. But that's a contribution to the whole world. Each of these nodes is like a headquarters for something else. In Mexico City, they run a similar contest for how to address the 15 global Millennium challenges, which I'll talk about in a second, with high school students around the world. In Korea, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, they want to put together a global climate change situation room. And hopefully we'll maybe collaborate, hopefully with some here in Google, or at least you'll use your products, in how to create a collective intelligence for a global climate change situation room. And if we do that correctly, that'll be something that all the other nodes can share, and maybe the UN systems as well. So this is sort of the management structure of the Millennium Project. We have 2 categories of things that the project produces. One is methods. This is Futures Research Methodology version 3.0. It has 39 chapters. More than half of the chapters have been written by the author of the method, or the inventor of the method, or someone who's contributed significantly to that method's evolution. It's about 1,300 pages. It's the largest collection of methods to explore the future, international peer review, that's ever been assembled anywhere, and there's not even a close second. So for those here in Google looking at future trends and future ideas and what's next and all that sort of stuff, here's some methods you may want to look through to see if there's something in there that you haven't used that you might be able to use. The other is the state of the future. That's the content part. So and that looks like a report or a book. It's also a management technique for us, because I had worked for right-wing, left-wing, up-wing, down-wing think tanks, and I was tired of the nonsense. That if one think tank says it, then another think tank says they got to be wrong. None of us, we all know that every think tank's got some sort of value. So we ought to create something across the board, which is part of the evolution of the Millennium Project. But one of the things that weren't being done was think tanks would do a report, and then they would do another study, another report, another study, another report, or someone would get together some big thing like the Club of Rome or the Interfutures or some big thing, big applause, and there's no accumulative wisdom going on. There's no system to improve the improvement of the improvement system. There's no systematic approach to that. So we figured we would have to do a State of the Future report each year, and then we would have to make sure that that report is better than last year. So what we write about water this year has to be more important than what I wrote about last year. So there's 13 of these things have been done so far, so anybody can see, is there an evolution of knowledge and better precision and so forth or not? So this is our own sort of self-evaluation tool. It comes in two parts. One is about 100 pages, very short summaries of various things for people to look at that are too busy to do the academic research. And then a CD-ROM that's got 6,700 pages. So if those who want the short version, you go to print. Those who want the details behind the research, what did the invitation letter look like? What did the questionnaire look like? What was the demographics? All the detail behind it is in the CD-ROM. So we began by saying what's happening in the world that is going to become a very big thing in, say, 25 years, that is either not known generally, or is misunderstood. What's going on? And what's that going to look like in 10 years? And what's that going to look like in 25 years? And give us a reference. So it wasn't just an opinion survey. People had to do some work to bring in ideas. And we collected something like 280 developments and went through a long, torturous process of interviewing policymakers and feedback systems. I won't bore you with that. We ended up with 15 issues. And our planning committee said, that's nice, you acted like engineers, you identified all these issues or problems, what about the opportunities, what about the good stuff? So the next year we did the same sort of process of having people ask these questions all around the world and doing the interviews, and we ended up with almost the same number, 280 some odd developments of good things that were important, either misunderstood or not known, that could evolve in the future. Then the third year we put the two together into the challenges. And then one of the planning committee members from Finland said, look, stop changing, please. We like your framework. We use it in our committee for the future in Parliament to do our evaluation. And if you keep changing, and it's difficult for us. So we haven't changed. We kept the 15 challenges since then up to the present tense. We may still change them. But so far, we think it's the best framework to understand what's happening in the world. First challenge, and I won't go into detail on all of these things, there's just too much information, but you can get it in the State of the Future. The first, and by the way, when I say first, it is not the most important. All 15 of these challenges are important. Just like your brain is important and your heart is important, and one is not more important than the other. But when you study biology, you list down the systems. So we're listing down these systems. This is a system. They're interdependent. If you improve one, you help the others. If you hurt one, you hurt the others. This is the system. This is the agenda for the humanity, but it's a system. So don't get lost in the idea that your preferred challenge is number 6 on the list. They're all 100% important. So how can sustainable development be achieved by all while addressing global climate change? As you know, that we've probably consumed more material on the Earth since World War II than all the years in the past. You all know all the issues of sustainability. I don't need to tell you. We cannot continue as we are. One of the issues, though, that we'd like more people to take seriously is this parts per million that people talk about in carbon. It has been discussed, should we have 550 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere, or should it be 450? It is now about 391 parts per million, and we already have the major ice areas of the Andes and the Himalayas and so forth around the world going down. And that means that rivers change, dry up. It means that farming changes. It means that we got mass migration coming up. We got serious stuff. So 390 parts per million is not sustainable now. To say that we have 450, to me, is a sham. When people say it's politically, we can't do a better job than that politically, I'm going, well, nature doesn't care about the politics, all due respect. So for those of you involved in the climate change conference, I hope you hold to the 350 mark rather than the 450 mark. How can we have enough water for everybody without conflict? As some of you may know, Frank does, I'm sure, over 40% of humanity gets its water today from sources, watersheds, that are controlled by 2 or more countries. And that's not necessarily so bad by itself, but you take the next fact, and it's a real problem. The water tables, the water layer underneath the ground, on all continents are going down and have been going down for some years. This is a very serious prescription for conflict, continuing conflict. In China and India, 40% of humanity, they're having very serious water problems. Our node chair in China was involved in those water scenarios 10 years ago, and they had good case, best case, worst case, middle case scenarios. And in China, the water scenarios in China, it showed that the situation in China would get worse for the next 15 to 17 years in the best case scenario. Meaning that in other words, 20 years, you're as bad off as you are now, but you got a lot more people. So holding political stability in China and India is going to be extremely difficult just from the point of view of water, let alone energy problems, let alone northwest China with the Islamic situation, let alone the rich-poor gaps going on in these countries. We, and since I'm here in Google, we in the United States are living to some degree in a bubble of stability, of relative peace, and so forth. If you look at the world in terms of what makes instability, list of various factors and so forth, and go around the world and take a look at what's going on, about half the world is potentially unstable. Doesn't mean it will go, but about half is potentially unstable. And water is one of the major issues on this one. We've got to create new forms of water. There's all kinds of new breakthroughs coming up. We've got to look at all kinds of ways to move from freshwater agriculture to saltwater. If you take a look at agriculture, it turns out that agriculture is the largest user of water. And the majority of that use of water is for animals. If you do a Google search on growing meat without animals, or having meat without growing animals, you'll find out there's an extraordinary amount of research going on right now to replace the use of pigs, cows, goats, growing them to do meat. We've got another 2.5 billion people coming up on the planet before 2050 because of the Googles of the world and various internet things. We've redistributed the means of creating wealth, which means these people will be probably wealthier than they were in the last 50 years. As wealth goes up, meat consumption goes up. If meat consumption goes up, the water use on the land goes up. And because there's a limited amount of land, that means the price of food will go up. Little children need iron and protein as a child growing up for their brain to work properly. Meat is one of the best ways to get iron and protein together. It's not the only ways, but it's one of the most efficient. People say, well, why not go to vegetarian? Okay, that's fine. But don't forget that the meat consumption goes up in India when income goes up. So if India cannot hold it as a culture, how can the rest of the world do it? So it seems we need to think about how we can get protein without growing animals and all the problems with that. And it looks like that's going to happen. There's been a lot of progress. The first patent was filed, by the way, in the Netherlands in, I think it was 1999, 6 months after I gave a talk to a guy who was from the Netherlands on the issue. But moving from animals production to make meat to animal-less production of meat would save a lot of land and a lot of water, free up fresh water. Secondly, there's a lot of species that can grow in salt water. A lot of plants along beaches, in the water, but on the beaches as well. We can irrigate along the coastlines of the world and do saltwater agriculture. That would free up also more fresh water as well. Now, if you can grow these plants along coastlines of the world, like the Somalis if they ever stop shooting each other, but places like Somalia with baking sun coming down like crazy, there's no vegetation in a lot of these coastlines. It's desert areas. But you can irrigate with salt water, so you can get rid of not only some of the freshwater problems with this, but one of the biggest problems farmers have today is it going to rain enough? You don't have an issue of drought. Drought doesn't matter. You can have a drought along Somalia forever, and saltwater agriculture is going to have the coastline green. Green for biofuels, because algae, as you know, is the greatest producer of biofuels by far. You can grow it like crazy, saltwater stuff. You can have food for humans, food for animals, and you have paper products. And it's also a carbon sink, because you're getting green where you did not have it before. Anyway, these are just a couple of ideas of how to address the water situation. How can population growth and resources be brought into balance? One quick little note on there that's not being paid attention to is that most of your population projections go up to 2050. Do your Google search to 2100 and get what the graph looks like. It goes up to 2050 and then it starts to come back down. Why? You have fewer, as the fertility rate goes down, there's fewer women later on having the babies. Okay, now, what that means is that you'll end up with, if those trends continue, which I don't think they will, but we've got to take them seriously, is that means that the vast majority by 2100 will be retired people. The social contract to handle retirement is going up in cost around the world. How can you run a civilization when the majority of people are old and retired? I don't think that can work. So either we got to get the fertility rate going, or we go like Japan and have a bunch of robots, or longevity kicks in. And longevity research is progressing quite well. Some of you are probably aware of it, but one simple idea is the telomeres, the ends of the DNA, telomeres. If we learn how to manage that relationship, that's the mechanical definition of aging. As you lose that material, you're rolling out older stuff. That's one approach. We're also finding out about how to re-stimulate stem cells, put them back into the body and the brain. Maybe we can make with artificial biology, little microbes that can clean out the plaque. There's a lot of ways that are in research now. But the long-term population problem is actually the aging phenomenon. The short term, the next 50 years, obviously it's the overcrowding, which then goes back to the efficiencies, addressing these challenges very fast. How can genuine democracy emerge from authoritarian regimes? I'd like you to know that democracy has been, as you can probably guess, a good, growing, healthy trend. But not for the last several years. Press freedoms have actually gone down in the last 7 years. Political freedoms have gone down a little bit, not a whole lot, but a little bit in the last 2 or 3 years. So it is not a done deal that democracy wins. Also, it's not a done deal that voting democracies is the only form of democracy. I mean, it seems to me we can rethink some new forms. Maybe some of the stuff being developed here in Google of self-organization is a new form of governance. How can policymaking be made more sensitive to long-term global perspectives? How can the global convergence of information and communication technologies work for everyone? I suppose there's a few answers in this organization. How can ethical market economies be encouraged to help reduce the gap between the rich and the poor? One that might be an interesting project that just ran across my mind right now for Google to volunteer on. Imagine you create a website of some sort, and that you have, in a lot of poor countries, they have very well-educated people who go and work for UNESCO or work for the World Bank or work for Google or something like that. And they're not necessarily going back. And they feel guilty and they give money back. There's a major activity giving money back to the world. It would be nice if they can give some of their brain power back too. Why not do a simple matching program between the development needs of the person's host original country and those hotshots in Europe, the United States, Japan, and so forth, to create like telenations? A thought to think about. But there you can use the power of the market in developing relations as well as, for example, let's say that you are a very good analyst on business plans. The average person in, say, Malawi doesn't know how to do a business plan. Okay? Well, maybe the Development DMAT organization in Malawi has a little computer connection we set up some years ago, and they put in there, here are some business plans. And that goes back to a Malawian, let's say, working for the World Bank. For him, it's no big deal going through the business plans and finding the mistakes and making some suggestions. So the small business people in Malawi are getting hotshot, first-class business management consulting. For him, it's a lark. It's sort of fun, and maybe an hour a week he can do it. For these people, it's livelihood. It's growth of the country. Anyway, just think of matching up the development needs of the world through the brain power of the world, and especially those that have left those countries to start with it. How can the threat of new and re-emerging diseases and immune microorganisms be reduced? As you may know, for the last 40 years, about one new disease that we didn't have before has come up. The normal model of sequencing the gene, creating a vaccine, producing the vaccine, getting it out. That takes time, even though we're down to sequencing in a couple of weeks very fast. It is not maybe the answer long term, because if it's the case that humans are compressing themselves into urban environments more and more and more, and we're compressing ourselves into new forms of pollution that we did not have before, if we're jet planing around the world more than before, it is reasonable to assume that the mutation and change and communicability of serious infectious diseases will be worse in the future than in the past. And if we're going with the same old strategy, we may not win. So another approach it's coming indirectly out of AIDS research, is to understand the immune system better and then understand it enough so that we can bring up the immune system to total strength, that no matter what the agent coming in, it holds it off long enough for the agent to die. So it's a temporary hold. So imagine if Ebola or hemorrhagic fever goes airborne. That's a pretty nasty image of the future. But if you had material that could bring up the immune system very fast, when you had it like fire extinguishers, you got fire extinguishers in different places. You don't know where the fire is going to be, but fire comes up, you contain it, and that's it. Well, imagine doing that as a model for communicable diseases, having these things around. So if something comes up in a certain place, you can immunize that area. You can hold the disease in that area. But we're going to have to come up with new models of treating communicable diseases, because I don't think our current direction is sustainable. How can the capacity to decide be improved as the nature of work and institutions change? We all know that the political process is pretty well clogged, and it's awfully complex, and it doesn't seem to be getting unclogged. So we need all kinds of innovations in this area. How can shared values and new security strategies reduce the ethnic conflicts, terrorism, and use of weapons of destruction? That's a real problem to work on. I will tell you, first of all, from our experience in doing the Millennium Project and its research for the last 13 years, it convinced me that almost every nasty problem you can throw out, there are some solutions. It's a question of getting the right information, the right people, right time, and all that sort of stuff, and the will to do it. Most of these things I've talked about have answers to them. You may argue about which answer, but there's answers. Here's one that is not an easy one. If you take out the trends of artificial biology, computer-aided design, and 3D biological printing, and the lower costs of all these capacities, you end up with the possibility of an individual acting alone, creating a bioweapon, and deploying it to wipe out an awful lot of the world. That's not here today, but it is possible tomorrow. How do you prevent that? Most of the systems of deterrence are thinking in terms of countries, ethnic groups, and things like that. But what about the mentally ill person who says, the Bible says people were so wicked, God wipes them out with a flood, and we start over again? Why couldn't someone come up with that same conclusion? Because it wouldn't need a flood. You got other means to do it. This is a serious long-term problem to address. And very quickly, the direction to prevent it, not good answers, but the direction is very low-cost, nano, multi-sensor networks of nanotechnology networks, biologicals, radiologicals, pressure, temperature, etc., so that you can start to monitor as much as possible. Every molecule change in public space along direction. But that's not good enough by itself, because as you all know here, if you can understand something, you can digitalize it. If you can digitalize it, you can hack it or change it. So that's good, but not good enough. The other is we want to reduce the population of crazy people who might do this. I assume all of you are not interested in wiping out civilization, so I'm not worried about you. You think about what percentage of the world is psychotic enough that they would want to wipe out the world. Small percent. But a small percent of, say, in 2050, 9 billion people is quite a few people. And by 2050, that capacity I just described certainly would be around at that time. So we want to reduce that number so we can take from cognitive science, take from learning theory, and integrate what we know about how a healthy human gets evolved, and take that deadly seriously, not just simply as an education exercise, but deadly seriously. It is important for all of us, idealistically, but it's important, idealistically, to take care of everybody's health growing up, because it only takes one person in this scenario. Right? So you want to reduce the numbers of people, you want to increase the sensitivity of the sensings. Those are the directions, but they're not good answers yet. How can changing status of women improve the human condition? I don't know if you know it, but the largest war on the planet today is men killing and hurting women. In the United Nations, we define war as 1,000 or more deaths a year. By that definition, it's the largest war. It's bigger than the war on terrorism. It's bigger than Afghanistan. But it's not being taken seriously. And this is an issue that's for us as a human family to think through. Do we want to call it a war? I don't know if it helps or hurts, actually. But I knew that we are not, we males especially, but we as a species are not taking seriously the violence toward women. One of the fun suggestions I gave on a teleconference the other day in Italy was the idea of having martial arts as a part of the normal physical education curriculum in public schools. And what that would mean by the time you're 12 years or 12th grade, if you've gone through 12 years of martial art training, you're probably a black belt or 2 or 3 black belts, and very few men will attack a 3-belt martial art martial art master, I suspect. Now, that's not the answer to the thing, but it can maybe help deter, just like during the Cold War, we deterred folks from having the war. How can transnational organized crime networks be stopped from becoming more powerful and sophisticated global enterprises? If you take all the military budgets of the world, you add them up, it's about 1.3, 1.5 billion, trillion with a T, trillion dollars. Organized crime is about twice that worldwide. I want that to sink in. Think of the infrastructure of the militaries of the world. Think of the cash, think of the personnel, think of the influence, think of its activities. Then double that and have it not on the radar map of most futurists in the world. It's extremely important. According to the World Bank, about $1 trillion are paid out in bribes. Let's say you knock out all the drug issues, you knock out illegal crime or illegal smuggling of weapons and prostitution and various other sort of activities. What happens? That means that money, that activity goes into new areas. What new areas might organized crime go into? They might be able to buy and sell government decisions, like they buy and sell heroin. This would make democracy an illusion. We need a global, integrated strategy to address global organized crime. We don't have that. We barely have it in countries because we divide up the policy in different areas. You know, this person's working on numbers, this person's working on illegal drug traffic, this one's working on this. But what is the integrated global strategy? Another task, another challenge for us. How can the global energy demands be safely and efficiently met? How can scientific and technological breakthroughs be accelerated to improve the human condition? And how can ethical considerations become more routinely incorporated into global decisions? This is the agenda put together by over 13, 14, 15 years of various futurists and policy people around the world. This is what we've got to get done. Now, one of the first challenge dealing with climate change, I'm very pleased to say the Millennium Project has been asked to help create the Global Climate Change Situation Room in Korea, South Korea. We did a little study a couple of years ago on how you would create a collective intelligence to address energy. And so we may be using that model and apply that to the Situation Room being created in South Korea. And we would invite any of the employees in Google to play with us. Because as you all know, you may design a system, but when you get into it, you try to improve it. So we hope by the time we actually put this Situation Room together, it'll be a real collective intelligence that all in the world can draw on. It will be a physical Situation Room, but the collective intelligence behind it should be available to everybody in some way that we have more and more people involved in this, because this is a human family issue. But the nice thing about the Situation Room, as distinct from just a collective intelligence, is that you also are taking a look at what governments say they're doing, what the policies are, what the gaps are, what the implementations are, what the status is, so that you're actually getting on phones and getting arm twisters to move it. So remember, the purpose of a Situation Room is to manage something. We don't have, you can do a Google search on this, we don't have, to my knowledge, a Situation Room, and if you find it, I want to know it, a Situation Room to manage the global climate change management issues. We've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but that's science, research, collaboration with a political veneer laid on top of it. But where do you go to see the whole situation? I know, you got to go to Google to see the whole situation. But maybe we can work together on this one. All right, what do I mean by collective intelligence? I mean an emergent property, first of all. It's not a thing itself. It's not all of us sitting here making a decision. I don't mean that as collective intelligence. I mean it's an emergent property. It's something that isn't there when you start to do it. It emerges from the synergies among data, knowledge, information, hardware, software, experts, that continually learns from feedback to produce nearly just-in-time knowledge for better decisions than those actions, and those elements acting alone. So that's what I mean when I say collective intelligence, an emergent property. So imagine creating a collective intelligence for climate change, that it's an emergent property and keeps growing and improving through time, and then you're hooking it up to decision maker for actions like a situation room should do. One of the, this is an abstract version of maybe an interface. We may or may not do it this way, but this is one of the ideas, is that we find continually that people get lost in detail and forget the big picture. And the big picture people sometimes don't know enough detail to make the right decisions. So this is a quandary. So one of the things, we want to have information displayed so they can always see where the piece fits into the whole all the time. This is one of the ideas. We made these maybe 3 columns or 4 columns, or maybe different ways of doing the searches. But this is the idea here is how do you create an interface, a user interface, so that as people do their searches, as they do their work, they're seeing how the part relates to the whole. Another aspect of this is that, let's say, for example, here's an information unit or a piece of information about photovoltaic efficiency. What we would like is that piece of information is linked to the column on the right-hand side. First would be an overview, and let me jump ahead and come back in a second. By overview, there's an old antique software called CM1. Some of you may remember it. But it's a way that you have a question like, how do you make photovoltaics more efficient? What are the 3 or 4 different categories of research on that? What are the pros and cons of each of this, and what are the references behind it? Why? Because people need to see the whole picture, but they can't be overloaded by all the detail. So this would be one kind of approach to having an overview of an issue. So you back up here. So a piece of information would be linked to its overview. Second, what are the problems and opportunities? Where do they come from? Well, we'd have groups of networks that the Millennium Project would organize around the world. They would be doing discussion in various collaborative systems, and we would be able to identify the problems and opportunities through that. We'd also be doing research, what's the data and forecast about that piece of information? Are there computer simulations that you can run? What are the expert ratings? The Millennium Project has developed a software called Real-Time Delphi. It's a polling system that updates in real time, so that we could constantly update among experts rating on a new piece of information as it comes in, and rank order them, by the way, within the display system. What are the unresolved issues? As they rate these if you have a bipolar distribution, that's clearly an unresolved issue. So it would be empirical on that. And we'd have open, non-peer-reviewed information as well. More open, more contemporary view here is the issues-based information system that we will probably be using. But the idea is to keep track of how the conversation goes in an organized, logical structure. One of the problems with blogs is that people repeat themselves. It's one thing after another, after another, after another, after another. It's a pain in the neck. Whereas this way, you have the information being edited, if all goes well, in these units. So each is a wiki by itself. It's going to a wiki point by itself, so that the overview of an issue is continually updated. This was not a database unit that sits there dead in the water. It's dynamic itself. Another is for the decision maker players, we want to be able to create some dashboards like this, for example, so that they can know the status of a decision, because there's 2 kinds of clients for this situation room. One are the people who want to understand, to know. The other is people who make decisions. Those are 2 different kinds of requirements. This is more for the decision makers, like what is a total picture on a particular issue? This happens to be solar power satellites. What's the total picture that I got to know in one shot? But then these elements are dynamic. They can keep changing. My colleague in front of me, Jack Park, could probably talk about this. Maybe in the question and answer period we can go into this. But the idea is that we want to federate all the capabilities and have people tagging information so that they get linked up in ways that we didn't know were even possible. And this is part of this idea of an emergent property. So how could you all participate? One, we'd like to talk to whomever is interested in how we develop the situation room in Korea. 2, we all goes well, how I can get Frank continue to be involved in the water projects, and how Google can be involved in those scenarios and display information systems for those scenarios in the UN water scenarios with UNESCO. A second is we hope to take the 15 global challenges I just went through and create a collective intelligence for each one and link them up. This would be a pretty good beginning of a global brain. We also are teaching online courses on these issues around the world. And I am sure that there are some new products or things coming up in Google that we probably haven't used yet or know about that could make those courses even better online. And of course, we'd be happy to have you have a sponsor. These are the people who were behind the Learning Project in the past. As I mentioned before, we get income from different categories, corporations, governments, foundations, and so forth. And that's all I have to say. Any questions? Yeah.
For collective intelligence, what do you see as the balance between experts doing these things and just opening it up to
Good.
everyone?
Perfecto. Perfecto. Now, understand, just like in your working world, you can be overruled by somebody later on who's got a better idea, but this is where I am so far on it, is I see like two semantic wikis in parallel. This one is the experts. This one is non-experts. But they're looking at each other. So the people that are pulling up this stuff in the non-expert area, they may be experts. We didn't know about them, and then they can switch over into here. So there's a relationship. It's like a farm team for this. So this is, if some stuff is far out over here, then no problem, it can be there. Because it's documenting the non-peer-reviewed stuff. But at the same time, my first email was 1973. I've been involved in computer communication stuff for a long time. And one thing I can tell you is that quality, as a generalization, is driven out of network systems, on these collaborative group systems. Because yeah, somebody comes in, wow, this is great, I'm going to improve my future, my career, I'm going to come in here, hang out with these hotshots. And then they say, now, what do you mean by a search engine? And you go like, who let him in the door? And eventually the hotshots start to leave out. So we want to figure out how to solve that problem, because we really want to have top brains in collaboration that haven't necessarily been in collaboration before for whatever reason. But we want them to be able to work together without having a lot of noise. Same time, we all know good ideas come out of left field, right field, upfield, downfield, right? So my answer so far, until you or somebody else comes up with a better approach, is to have two parallel systems, but have them inform each other and federate so that those information can actually cut across. But you don't ask the expert to read 50 emails a day. He'll leave. Yeah. Yeah.
Another question is, how do you see these things being acted on? So your 15 themes, and do you have recommendations as well, something like that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, little detail. We've got about 1,400 pages on the 15 challenges already. So, yes, we'll start with a lot of stuff that we've done over a bunch of years as sort of like chumming the waters to begin with. Yeah, no, we would dump what we have in the system. And that would grow very rapidly, I am sure.
I guess separately then, so how do these things in your mind or in practice move from recommendation to actually happening in your world?
Well, we've passed the recommendation part. I'm just, we've already been contracted. We will do it. We haven't, as a matter of fact, right after this talk, some of the players will be meeting near NASA Ames, and we're going to be going through some of the implementation steps. So it's not that we're recommending, we'll be recommending to ourselves how to do it. It's the Korean organization have already said, we want you to do it. They have seen our previous ideas. They saw the genus model. You saw the opening slide there that they've already gotten the political people done. So to do it or not to do it, we're past that. Now the question is how. Now we have a plan, we have ideas, but that doesn't mean that's what it's going to be a year from now. I mean, we bring together a bunch of hotshots. They're going to outthink each other, so we're going to be growing as we go along. We're starting with I guess maybe part of your question is we have an initial planning committee that we're working with. And we will start cranking out the software, putting the stuff in, having the meetings, changing, and so forth. So we're right now at the beginning startup of it. That's one of the good things about the timing today. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.